the small, quiet town of Abbeville, Alabama, the legend of Huggin' Molly loomed like a dark cloud over the community. Whispers of a towering woman in black who roamed the streets at night to ensnare the unsuspecting in a suffocating embrace had been passed down for generations. Some dismissed it as a harmless tale, but curiosity had a way of taking hold, especially on still, moonlit nights. On one such evening, two teenagers ventured to the edge of town, drawn by a mix of boredom and the desire to prove the legend wrong. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on gravel. As they walked down a narrow road flanked by tall, shadowy trees, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the surrounding darkness pressed in closer. The faint rustle of leaves came from the roadside, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. Both teens paused, their eyes scanning the shadows. From the blackness, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked woman who seemed to float rather than walk. Her pale, otherworldly face gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and her outstretched arms beckoned with a haunting purpose. Frozen in place, one of them felt the chill of her presence before she enveloped him in an iron grip. The sensation was suffocating, as though the air itself had been stolen. His companion stood motionless, her heart pounding as she watched the figure lean closer to him. The silence was shattered with a piercing scream and a sound so unnatural and resonant that it reverberated through the trees and sent a shiver down the spines of both teens. In an instant, the figure released him and dissolved back into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of her terrible cry. The two fled back towards town, their breaths ragged and minds reeling. The warmth of the familiar streets felt surreal after the icy, oppressive presence they had encountered. The legend of Huggin' Molly was no longer a distant story or a local myth. It was real, and the memory of that night would linger like a shadow in their lives, a chilling reminder of the unseen mysteries that sometimes walk among us. The frozen wind howled across the desolate shoreline, whipping up the snow and ice like restless spirits. Beneath the brittle crust of the Arctic waters, shadows stirred. The Qualupalik, a creature of ancient Inuit legend, waded beneath the ice, her green, translucent skin blending seamlessly with the frigid depths. Her long, webbed fingers traced lazy circles in the water, the eerie hum of her song vibrating through the frozen sea. It was a melody both alluring and foreboding, carrying the weight of countless tales whispered in the long Arctic nights. Above, a young boy wandered too close to the edge of the ice, his small boots crunching softly against the frosty ground. He was drawn in by the strange sound, though he couldn't understand why. The song wasn't loud, but it pulsed in his chest, pulling him towards the icy shore. The boy's family had often warned him about the Qualupalik, the child stealer who lurked beneath the ice. They say her voice could mesmerize, her touch as cold as death, but curiosity and youth had a stronger pull than fear that day. The ice beneath him groaned as he knelt to peer into the water. Deep below, the faint flicker of movement caught his eye. A face, pale and alien, surfaced for the briefest moment, a glimpse of sharp teeth and hollow, unblinking eyes. The boy stumbled back, breaking the spell as a long, clawed hand breached the surface, seeking purchase on the fragile ice. With a loud crack, the ice began to splinter. The boy scrambled backwards as the Qualupalik's hum grew louder, more insistent, her form rising ever closer to the surface. Just as she broke through, the boy's hand found a jagged rock. He hurled it instinctively at the creature, the sound of the impact echoing like a gunshot. The Qualupalik shrieked, a sound that pierced the icy air before vanishing beneath the waves, leaving the waters still once more. The boy fled, his heart pounding, the haunting melody still faintly echoing in his ears as he disappeared into the safety of his village. That night, as the elders recounted stories of the Qualupalik by the fire, the boy sat silently, clutching the rock that saved his life, vowing never to wander alone near that ice again. The air was heavy as dusk settled over the barren desert outside Kingman, Arizona. The last rays of sunlight painted the jagged cliffs of Slaughterhouse Canyon, in hues of deep crimson, as if the land itself bled from some ancient wound. A young hiker, Jake, ventured cautiously into the canyon, drawn in by haunting stories he had overheard in a roadside diner earlier that day. Locals called it La Llorona of the West, a place cursed by the ghost of a grieving mother who had lost her mind in the throes of starvation centuries ago. The trail narrowed as Jake moved deeper into the canyon. The walls loomed higher, their jagged edges casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to snare him. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under his boots and the distant whispers of the wind. Yet, something else prickled at the edge of his senses, a faint, keening wail that seemed to rise and fall like a mournful lullaby. He paused, straining to hear. It was impossible to tell if the sound was real or the product of his own overactive imagination, fueled by the legend. They said a destitute family once lived here, the father gone too long on a failed hunt. In her despair, the mother had taken her children's lives, unable to watch them waste away. Her screams, they said, still echoed through the canyon. The wail grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. Jake's pulse quickened as a chill crept up his spine, despite the desert heat. He glanced around, the walls now seeming to close in on him, the shadows deepening unnaturally. Something caught his eye, a faint movement near the edge of a rocky outcrop. It looked like a figure, draped in tattered white, swaying as if in mourning. Jake froze, heart pounding. The figure seemed to dissolve into the rock as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing but an eerie cry that now surrounded him, louder and more anguished than before. Panic took hold. He turned and bolted back towards the entrance of the canyon, the sound chasing him like an unseen predator. When he finally emerged into the open desert, the crying ceased abruptly, as if the canyon itself had swallowed it whole. Gasping for breath, Jake glanced back, half expecting to see the figure again, but the canyon was silent, its blood-red walls now fading into the twilight. Jake didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he sped away, he realized the eerie wail wasn't just a legend. Something lingered in Slaughterhouse Canyon, something that refused to let go of its pain. The night was still, the air heavy with the damp chill of the Arkansas woods. James had heard the stories of the Gurdon Light his entire life, but skepticism ran deep in his veins. He had always dismissed the tales as a mixture of folklore and overactive imaginations. Still, when his friends backed out of their late-night expedition to the old railroad tracks, he decided to go alone. He wanted to see for himself what all the fuss was about. He parked his truck at the edge of the woods and walked the narrow, overgrown trail that led to the tracks. His flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted rails and tufts of grass growing between the ties. The cricket's chirping was the only sound he heard, but the deeper he ventured, the quieter the forest became, as if holding its breath. Reaching the section of tracks where the light was most often seen, James stopped and waited. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the oppressive silence began to gnaw at his nerves. He scanned the horizon, his flashlight flickering slightly. Then it appeared. At first, it was just a faint glow, hovering a few feet above the tracks. It wavered like a firefly, growing brighter and more distinct. The light seemed to pulse, shifting from white to an eerie green. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The stories had always said the light was unexplainable, floating there without a source, detached from any natural explanation. As he watched, the light began to move, slowly at first, then faster, zigzagging along the rails. It danced erratically, as if it had a mind of its own. James felt his skin prickle, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. A chill seeped into his bones, and he suddenly felt the weight of the stories of the murdered railway worker whose spirit was said to haunt the stretch of track, searching for his lantern. The light darted closer, and James stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and plunging him into near total darkness. He fumbled for it, but by the time he raised it again, the light was gone. The tracks lay empty, silent as the grave. Without waiting to see if it would return, James turned and sprinted back to his truck, the crunch of gravel underfoot chasing him like an echo. When he reached the safety of his vehicle, his chest heaving, he cast one last glance at the tree line. The light was gone. but he knew he would never dismiss the stories again. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the dense oaks and tangled underbrush of San Antonio Creek shrouded in shadow. Elise had always been drawn to the macabre, and the legend of Charman, a ghostly figure said to haunt these woods, was too enticing to resist. Armed with only a flashlight and her phone to document the experience, she ventured out alone, waiting for the faint trail that hugged the edge of the creek. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and charred wood, an unsettling combination she chalked up to her overactive imagination. The stories always described Charman as the tormented ghost of a man who perished in a fire, his burned and disfigured form forever wandering the area. Elise tried to brush off the unease prickling at her skin. Urban legends were just that, stories. The trail narrowed and the gurgling creek became a whisper in the distance. Her flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced among the trees. She stopped to adjust the batteries, her breath visible in the sudden chill. And that's when she smelled it, smoke. Acrid and sharp, it filled her nostrils, making her eyes water. She looked around, but saw no signs of a fire. Then, faintly, she heard the sound, a raspy wheeze like someone struggling for air, carried through the stillness. Her chest tightened as she scanned the woods, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her grip. The noise grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Elise's pulse quickened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, her foot catching on an exposed root. She fell hard, the flashlight skittering out of reach. In the darkness, the wheezing sound closed in, now almost inhuman in its intensity. She scrambled for the flashlight, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp ground before gripping it. As she raised the beam, her breath caught. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the light, its outline warped and mishappened. The smell of smoke intensified, and the figure's skin seemed to glisten unnaturally, like a molten wax. It moved towards her, each step slow and deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Without thinking, Elise bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. She didn't look back, the sound of her own panicked breaths drowning out everything. The smell of the smoke clung to her as she reached the safety of her car and slammed the door shut. Driving away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure pursuing her. But the road was empty, the woods eerily quiet. Still, the scent of smoke lingered in her nostrils, a reminder that some stories might not be so far from the truth. The Ridge Home Asylum has been abandoned for decades, but its reputation still loomed large over the town of Arvada, Colorado. Locals whispered about the atrocities that had taken place within its walls, stories of mistreatment, failed experiments, and the restless spirits of patients who have never left. For Jenna, the allure of the asylum was irresistible. A self-proclaimed urban explorer, she was always chasing the thrill of the unknown, and crumbling remains of Ridge Home felt like the ultimate conquest. On a crisp autumn evening, she parked her car near the edge of the property and slipped through a gap in the rusted chain-link fence. The asylum loomed ahead, its facade cracked and weathered, windows like empty eyes staring into the void. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Jenna stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was a maze of decayed walls and broken furniture. Graffiti covered what remained of the plaster, and the floor creaked beneath her boots. Each step echoed through the hollow halls, making her hyper-aware of the stillness around her. She wandered through the asylum, snapping photos of peeling paint and rusted gurneys. In one room, she found an overturned wheelchair, its wheels frozen in place as though time itself had abandoned it. The longer she stayed, the heavier the air became, thick with an inexplicable tension. Jenna ventured deeper into the building, eventually reaching the basement. The air here was damp and musty, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach turn. The flashlight's beam caught old medical equipment scattered across the floor, tools that looked more suited for torture than treatment. She took a photo, her camera's flash illuminating the space for a brief moment. And that's when she heard it, a faint shuffle, like footsteps dragging across the floor. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, closer this time. Her flashlight darted across the room, but nothing moved. She told herself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but the hairs on her neck told a different story. Then, from somewhere deeper in the basement came a low, guttural moan. It reverberated through the concrete walls, unmistakably human yet distorted, as if it came from a throat long unused. Jenna's pulse quickened, and she stumbled backwards, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. A shadow, a figure hunched and unnatural, emerged from the darkness. It didn't move like a person, its limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. The flashlight flickered, plunging her into a momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but the moaning grew louder, now echoing from every direction. Panic overtook her, and Jenna ran, her boots pounding against the cracked tile floor. The halls twisted and blurred, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was even heading towards the exit. Finally, she burst outside, gasping for air, her heart racing. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, the asylum shrinking in her rearview mirror as she sped away. Later that night, she reviewed the photos on her camera. Most were as she expected, dark, eerie images of decayed walls and abandoned furniture. But one made her blood run cold. In the photo of a wheelchair, a shadowy figure stood in the background, its hollow eyes fixed on the lens. The dense canopy of trees loomed overhead as Clara stepped out into the shadowy remains of Dudleytown, Connecticut. The village, long abandoned and rumored to be cursed, was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Clara had heard the whispers about this place, a town said to have brought ruin to all who lived there. But as an amateur historian, she couldn't resist the lure of exploring its decayed remnants. The trail was overgrown, winding to the forest like a forgotten vein. Clara clutched her camera tightly, snapping photos of crumbled stone foundations half swallowed by moss. The air felt heavier here, as though the forest itself was pressing down on her. Every now and then she thought she heard faint whispers, but they were always too faint to discern. A trick of the wind, she told herself. As she reached what appeared to be the ruins of an old home, Clara stopped. The stones were blackened, as if touched by fire, and the surrounding trees seemed to lean unnaturally towards the structure. She raised her camera, but when she did, a sudden chill swept through the air. It was kind of cold that sank into your bones, unnatural for the time of the year. Her finger hovered over the shutter button when she caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned sharply, her flashlight sweeping the dense forests. Nothing. But that uneasy feeling lingered, a weight that settled deep in her chest. She decided to keep moving. As she walked, the woods grew darker, as though the sun itself had been blotted out. The trail began to disappear, and Clara realized she wasn't sure where she had entered. She checked her phone for GPS, but the signal was gone. Frustration turned to unease when she noticed something else. The whispers had returned, faint but consistent, as if carried on a breeze she couldn't feel. She quickened her pace, the crunch of leaves underfoot seemingly too loud in the oppressive silence. The forest felt alive, every branch and shadow watching her. Then she saw it, an unnatural figure standing in the distance, shrouded in the dim light. It was tall, featureless, and impossibly still, blending into the shadows, yet undeniably there. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figures didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, as if emanating from all directions. Panic took hold, and she turned, running blindly through the woods. Branches clawed at her arms, and the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. She didn't stop until she burst into a clearing, gasping for breath. The ruins were gone, the trees standing silent and still. Her phone buzzed faintly as she regained signal, and she realized she was back near her car. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see the figure pursuing her, but the forest was empty. Driving away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watched the entire time. Later, when she reviewed her camera, the photos of Dudleytown were inexplicably dark, each frame obscured by shadows. The mist hung thick over the Delaware River as Noah approached Fort Delaware, its stone walls rising out of the water like a forgotten relic. The fort had been abandoned for over a century, and the rumors surrounding it were as old as the structure itself. Locals spoke of strange lights, eerie sounds, and the restless spirits of soldiers who had died in the fort's prison during the Civil War. Noah wasn't one buying into the ghost stories, though. But something about the fort's long, tragic history pulled him in. He had to see it for himself. He arrived just before sunset, eager to explore before darkness fully set in. A small boat had ferried him across to the island. As he disembarked, he could already feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. The fort loomed ahead, its stone walls cracked and worn by time, the air around it thick with the scent of decay. Noah's flashlight illuminated the path ahead of him as he stepped closer to the entrance. The massive wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, revealing the darkness within. The floors groaned beneath his boots as he ventured deeper into the fort, his flashlight beam dancing across the long abandoned barracks, storage rooms, and prison cells. He snapped a few photos, the eerie silence overwhelming him with each click of the shutter. It wasn't long before Noah noticed something unsettling. The air grew colder the further he ventured inside. His breath became visible, hanging in the air like fog. And then, faintly, he heard it. The soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. He spun around, but the corridor was empty, nothing but crumbling walls and faded paint. He stood still for a moment, listening, but the sound of the footsteps was gone. He continued down the hall, passing an old cell that had long been left untouched. As he approached, he noticed the bars. The rusted metal was chipped, but the unmistakable shape of a figure seemed to stand behind them, too still, too quiet. Noah's heart skipped a beat, his flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, the figure seemed to move, its outline becoming clearer in the beam of light. It wasn't a person, though. It was a shape, featureless and shadowy, a silhouette of something that didn't belong. His breath quickened, panic creeping into his chest. He backed away, his foot catching on something, sending a loud crash through the stillness of the fort. Noah stumbled to his feet, and he turned and ran, the sound of the unseen footsteps echoing in the halls behind him. Always just a few steps too close. He didn't stop until he reached the front gate, gasping for air. The boat was waiting for him, and he scrambled aboard, the mist swirling around the island as if trying to swallow him whole. As the boat drifted away from Fort Delaware, Noah cast one final look at the silhouette of the fort, its stone walls looming against the darkened sky. The warm night air wrapped around Key West like a velvet cloak as the neon sign for Captain Tony's Saloon flickered in the darkness. Tourists and locals alike crowded the bar, their laughter and shadows echoing against the aged brick walls. Beneath the saloon's wooden floor, however, a darker story lingered, one whispered among patrons with hushed tones and wary glances. Years ago, during renovations to transform the building into the iconic saloon it is today, workers uncovered human remains beneath the floorboards. Among the bones, they found an iron ring, rusted and ancient, still embedded in the stone wall, a relic of an era when the building served as a morgue and an execution site. The locals spoke of a woman accused of murdering her husband who had been chained to that very wall to await her fate. Some say she cursed the ground with her final breath. Tonight, the air in the saloon seemed heavier, as if the past had seeped into the present. A shadow moved along the wall, fleeting and shapeless. A waitress balancing a tray of drinks stumbled as if something had tugged at her ankle. Glass shattered on the floor as a gust of cold air brushed through the room. The jukebox, silenced moments before, clicked to life, playing a haunting melody no one had selected. The regulars exchanged knowing glances. It wasn't the first time strange occurrences had disrupted the bar's lively atmosphere, and it wouldn't be the last. Captain Tony's Saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a portal to the island's shadowy history, a place where spirits lingered, watching as life carried on above their restless graves. The moon hung high over Lake Lanier, its silver light casting an eerie glow across the rippling surface. The reservoir, vast and still, seemed to breathe with an unseen life. Swimmers and boaters had long since retreated, leaving the lake quiet but for the occasional rustle of trees or the distant cry of a bird. But beneath the calm exterior, the lake hid a history that refused to rest. Decades earlier, entire towns had been submerged when the reservoir was created. Homes, churches, cemeteries. The remnants of those communities still lay beneath the murky water, frozen in time. Locals whispered of strange happenings, unexplained drownings, ghostly figures walking across the water, and icy hands tugging at swimmers from below. That night, a lone fisherman sat in a small boat near the center of the lake. He cast his line into the dark water, the gentle plunk breaking the silence. Hours passed with little activity, and he began to doze off, lulled by the rhythmic rocking of the boat. Suddenly, the line jerked violently, pulling him awake. He gripped his rod, struggling against whatever massive force had taken the bait. The boat tipped dangerously as he fought, his hands burning against the reel. But then, just as abruptly as it began, the tension disappeared. He peered over the edge, heart pounding. The water seemed to swirl unnaturally, darker than before. A chill crept through the air, sending goosebumps up his arms. Beneath the surface, something moved, an outline of what seemed like a human figure, arms outstretched as if reaching for him. Panicked, the fisherman scrambled to start his motor. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, and he sped towards the shore, refusing to look back. When he reached land, he turned to face the lake one last time. The water was still again, calm and unassuming, as though nothing had happened. But he knew better. The legends of Lake Lanier weren't just stories. Something was down there, waiting. The humid Hawaiian night was alive with the sound of rustling leaves and the faint crash of waves against the distant shore. High in the hills, where the moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy of the trees, the jungle felt ancient, untouched by time. A lone hiker, a newcomer to the island, followed a narrow trail that he had been warned not to take after dark. The air grew heavy, the usual chorus of crickets and frogs falling silent. The hiker stopped, his flashlight cutting through the dense foliage. But the beam seemed weaker now, as if darkness had thickened. A faint drum beat echoed through the night, steady and rhythmic, growing louder with every second. The hiker's heart raced as the sound drew closer. He felt a strange pull to the side of the trail, where the trees opened to reveal a wide, ancient path, glowing faintly under the moon's watchful eye. Mist swirled along the ground, and suddenly they appeared, figures moving in perfect formation. Barely visible, they were clad in traditional Hawaiian garments, their bodies illuminated by otherworldly glow. Each step was purposeful, their expressions solemn. Torches burned in their hand, casting flickering lights that danced across their faces. The hiker's instinct screamed at him to move, to flee, but his body refused to obey. He dropped to his knees, lowering his eyes to the ground, a primal fear overtaking him. He had heard the legends of the night marchers, ancient warriors bound to the land, destined to roam sacred paths, punishing those who dared to cross their way. The procession passed, the drum beats fading into the distance. When the hiker finally dared to look up, the path was empty, the jungle once again alive in its nighttime symphony. He scrambled back to the trail and ran, vowing never to return. The wind swept through the barren landscape of massacre rocks, carrying with it a deep, biting chill. The Snake River shimmered under the moonlight, its surface deceptively calm. For Alex, the overnight camping trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a chance to disconnect and find solace in nature. He'd heard of the legends surrounding the area, whispers of tragic history and restless spirits, but he dismissed them as local folklore. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of the flames and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the hours stretched into night, an unnatural stillness settled over the area. The river, once soothing, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Alex noticed faint splashes breaking the surface, though no fish or animals were in sight. Then came a sound, a soft, distant wailing. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the cries grew louder, more distinct. They sounded like a baby, high-pitched and desperate, carried across the water. A cold dread crept into Alex's chest. He turned his flashlight towards the river, its beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, the light reflected off the surface, revealing ripples that seemed to move against the current. Then he saw it, a small figure, barely visible, slipping just beneath the water. He froze, unable to tear his eyes away. The cries intensified, echoing around him as if coming from every direction. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, as the fire suddenly sputtered out. The air felt heavier, oppressive, and Alex swore he saw movement in his peripheral vision. Tiny, pale hands reaching towards the shore. Panic overtook him. Grabbing only his car keys, Alex bolted up the path towards his vehicle, the cries still ringing in his ears. As he drove away, the sound faded, leaving only the roar of his engine and the pounding of his heart. Days later, Alex learned the stories of the water babies. spirits tied to the river by a history of loss and despair. He hadn't believed in such things before, but that night at Massacre Rocks left him questioning everything. Something was out there, something he'd felt, seen, and heard, and it wasn't just a legend. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the abandoned gravestones of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. Hidden deep within the forest near Chicago, the small, overgrown burial ground was a place shrouded in mystery and tales of ghostly apparitions. Its crumbling headstones leaned at odd angles, some swallowed by the earth, while at the pond the edge of grounds glistened with an unnatural stillness. Eric and his friends had come to the cemetery on a dare, armed with flashlights and a sense of bravado. The stories of vanishing figures, phantom lights, and eerie sounds were just that to them, stories. As the last light faded, the group explored the cemetery, their laughter echoing against the silence. But the air changed suddenly, growing thick and oppressive. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and even the chirping of crickets fell silent. Eric felt a shift before he saw anything, a prickle at the back of his neck that made him pause. Turning towards the pond, his flashlight illuminated a figure in white, standing near the water's edge. The figure was a woman, pale and translucent, her gown flowing as though caught in a gentle breeze. She stood motionless, her face turned away from him, staring into the still water. Eric's breath caught in his throat, his flashlight trembling in his hands. He called to his friends, but the words stuck, unspoken. The woman began to move, gliding towards the pond, her form wavering like a reflection in rippling water. The beam of his flashlight passed through her, as though she wasn't there. Then, with a final step, she vanished, dissolving into thin air. Eric's friends ran to him, their faces pale, having seen the same thing from the other side of the cemetery. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the distant hum of night sounds returning. The group fled without a word, leaving the cemetery behind. Eric never returned to Bachelor's Grove, but the image of the woman by the pond haunted his dreams. The legend wasn't just a story, it was real, and he had seen it with his own eyes. Under the pale glow of the moon, the 100-step cemetery in Indiana loomed like a dark shadow against the rolling hills. The worn stone steps, cracked and uneven with age, climbed sharply up to a hill to the old burial ground at the top. Legend had it that anyone who climbed the steps at midnight would meet the ghostly keeper of the cemetery, who would reveal the moment of their death. Caroline had heard the stories before, but dismissed them as superstition. That night, she stood at the bottom of the steps, flashlight in hand, curiosity outweighing her fear. The air was cold, far colder than the crisp fall evening should have been. She took a deep breath and placed her foot on the first step. The woods surrounding her were unnaturally quiet as she climbed, counting each step aloud in her head. The numbers came easy at first, but with every step, the air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest. At the 50th step, her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in near total darkness. She hesitated, but forced herself to continue, feeling the way with her trembling hands. By the 100th step, she reached the top. A faint mist clung to the ground, and the gravestones seemed to lean in towards her, their shapes blurred and shifting. Caroline's pulse quickened as she scanned the area. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Then she saw him. A shadowy figure emerged from the mist, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by darkness. He raised an arm, bony and skeletal, and pointed directly at her. Her breath caught as her vision blurred, the image of her own death flashing in her mind. Panicked, she turned and ran down the steps, counting again in her head, desperate to break the spell. But when she reached the bottom, she counted only 99 steps. Confused and terrified, she fled to her car, vowing never to return. Caroline never told anyone what she had seen at the top, but the experience stayed with her. The legend of the 100-step cemetery was no mere tale. She had faced its truth, and it had marked her forever. The Villisca Axe Murder House stood in eerie silence, its modest frame illuminated by the pale moonlight. The house, frozen in time since that brutal June night in 1912, drew visitors from across the country, daring to confront its haunted history. Tonight, it was Chris's turn, a skeptic lured by curiosity. The house creaked with every step as he moved through its darkened halls. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of wood and something metallic, as if the violence of that long-ago night had seeped into its bones. Chris's flashlight scanned the walls, revealing the preserved furnishings of a family home that once buzzed with life. He entered the children's bedroom, where tiny beds stood side by side. The room was still, unnaturally so. A faint scratching sound came from the far corner, but there was nothing there. As Chris stepped further in, the temperature dropped sharply, chilling him to the core. The flashlight flickered and then died, plunging him into darkness. His breath quickened as faint footsteps echoed above him, moving slowly across the attic floor. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as though descending the attic stairs towards him. Chris stood there frozen, unable to move. He felt a presence, something unseen yet suffocatingly close. The air around him vibrated with energy, and a faint whisper, distinct but chilling, brushed against his ears. Suddenly, the door in the room creaked shut with deliberate slowness. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he saw a shadow pass by, a figure moving unnaturally, as if gliding rather than walking. It stopped at the doorway, its outline barely human, and lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then it vanished. The house fell silent once more, but Chris didn't stay to see what might happen next. He bolted from the room, his footsteps pounding down the stairs and out the front door. Chris never doubted the stories again. The Villisca Axe murder house wasn't just haunted by history, it was alive with it, and its ghosts weren't content to remain in the past. The road to the hollow was a winding path flanked by dense trees whose branches twisted and intertwined like dark fingers reaching across the sky. Emma had heard the rumors of the restless spirit that haunted this forsaken place. They said it was a girl, betrayed by love, who had met a tragic end a long time ago, and now her sorrowful presence lingered in the woods, waiting for those brave enough to come near. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, Emma ventured deeper into the hollow, the distant hoot of an owl breaking the unnerving silence. Her flashlight illuminated the trail ahead, but as she reached the clearing, a towering tree came into view, its dark, gnarled limbs stretching towards the sky like a twisted sentinel. Standing there, Emma felt an eerie stillness that made her skin prickle. The atmosphere was thick, as though the very air had absorbed the sorrow of this place. A faint rustle from the far side of the clearing caught her attention. She turned slowly, and for a fleeting moment, saw a figure, cloaked in white, standing at the edge of the trees. It was impossible to make out details, but there was an undeniable presence about it, a feeling of overwhelming sadness. The figure stood motionless, as if locked in time, its face obscured in shadow. Emma's heart raced as the figure seemed to glide forward, drawn toward the center of the clearing. The air grew colder with each passing second, and Emma could feel her chest tighten with an unexplained dread. The figure, still silent, moved under the tree, where it paused and seemed to fade into the mist that had begun to rise from the ground. The oppressive silence returned and the coldness lifted, but Emma stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the lingering presence of the spirit, a deep sorrow that would not easily be forgotten. Without looking back, she turned and hurried towards the path, the feeling of being watched never leaving her until she reached the safety of her car. The hollow was quiet once more, but Emma knew she had encountered something that night, a presence bound to the land, a sorrowful spirit that would never be at peace. The night was thick with fog as Tom ventured through the woods near Popelik, Kentucky. The moon barely pierced through the haze, casting shadows across the rusty remains of an old train trestle that loomed ahead, silent and forgotten. Local legends had always intrigued Tom, but the story of the Goat Man, a creature said to lurk near the trestle, haunted him the most. The half-man, half-goat creature was rumored to lure unsuspecting victims onto the tracks, where they would meet a gruesome fate at the hands of an oncoming train. Tom had dismissed the tales as nothing more than folklore, the kind that spread like wildfire in small towns. But tonight he stood beneath the trestle. The air was unnervingly still, and something about the woods felt different, alive in a way he couldn't quite explain. He crept closer, his flashlight cutting through the mist, revealing nothing but trees and the crumbling remains of an old wooden support. The train trestle stretched out in front of him like a bridge to nowhere, its rusted tracks winding into the darkness. A sudden rustle in the underbrush caught his attention. Tom froze. A shadow shifted at the edge of the trestle, large and hulking. His eyes strained at the dim light, trying to make sense of the movement. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was twisted, with the head of a goat and the broad frame of a man, hunched as if waiting. The figure's eyes gleamed an unnatural glow reflecting the faint light, and it stood motionless, staring at Tom. A distant rumble echoed through the fog, the unmistakable sound of a train, though Tom could see no lights or tracks beyond the trestle. In a sudden rush of fear, Tom turned and fled, his feet pounding against the earth, the creature's presence lingering in the air behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his car. His heart raced as he glanced back at the trestle, but the fog had swallowed everything up again, leaving only the silence of the woods. The air was thick with the humid weight of Louisiana's swamps. Tyler had heard whispers in town about the Grunch, a strange, deformed creature said to lurk in the dark, abandoned areas near the outskirts of New Orleans. The creature was half human, half beast, with glowing red eyes and a hunger for those who dared venture too close to its territory. But these were just stories, right? Ghost stories to frighten children and keep them away from the old roads at night. Curiosity led Tyler to the forgotten outskirts where few dared to go. His headlights barely cut through the dense fog as he turned onto the narrow dirt road. The landscape was something out of a dream, gnarled trees twisted like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with Spanish moss hanging like drapes from another era. The road ahead stretched into an impenetrable darkness, the moonlight failing to break through the thick canopy above. And then there was a sound, a rustling in the underbrush, far too close. Tyler slowed his car, his heart racing. The rustling grew louder, followed by what sounded like a low growl. He turned to look out the side window, but all he saw was an endless wall of trees. Then, a movement caught his eye, a shadow darting between the trunks, too quick to identify. His grip tightened on the wheel, his breath coming faster. Suddenly, the headlights flickered and went out. But before he could react, something scraped against the side of his car, long, sharp claws dragging down the metal. A sharp, guttural hiss filled the air, and then silence. Tyler sat frozen, every sense on high alert. When the headlights flickered back to life moments later, the woods were still, eerily quiet again. There was no trace of this creature, no sign of what had caused the disturbance. As he left the swamp behind, he knew one thing for certain. The Grunch wasn't just a tale. It was real, and it had been watching him. The cold wind off the Atlantic whipped around the rocky shoreline of Seguin Island, pushing the air deep into the bones of anyone who dared venture close. The Seguin Island lighthouse stood tall, its weathered white walls a stark contrast against the gray sky. For years, the island had been shrouded in stories of the ghostly figure of a lighthouse keeper, still tending to his post long after his death, and the eerie light that appeared to flicker from the tower on stormy nights. Julie had heard the stories but never put any much stock into ghostly legends. She had come to Seguin Island to explore, to experience the lighthouse for herself. She stepped onto the island. The air seemed unnaturally still, the unusual bustle of seabirds and crashing waves oddly absent. The only sound was the rhythmic pulse of the foghorn in the distance. She made her way towards the lighthouse, the stone path winding up the hill towards the tower. The tower loomed in front of her, its door ajar, as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was cool and musty, heavy with the scent of salt water and old wood. The circular staircase creaked beneath her feet as she ascended, the beam of her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. She had finally reached the top, and that is when she saw him, a figure standing by the railing, his form solid but faded, as though he were both there and not there. His uniform was old-fashioned, the kind from a century ago, and his face was hidden in shadow, his eyes unblinking. Julie froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, but there was a palpable sense of sorrow in the air. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded, disappearing into the cold mist that had begun to roll in from the sea. The lighthouse was silenced once more, but Julie couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As she descended the stairs and left the lighthouse behind, she felt as though something was watching her, something that had never truly left. The legend of the Goat Man, a creature said to roam remote parts of Maryland's woods, had intrigued Sarah for years. Stories of its twisted, half-human, half-goat form and its eerie call that echoed through the trees were passed around in hushed tones, usually dismissed as mere folklore. But tonight, Sarah was determined to see for herself. She pushed through the forest. Every step felt too loud. Every branch she brushed against seemed to whisper warnings. The path grew less defined as she ventured further, the trees growing taller and more twisted, as though the woods themselves were shifting around her. Then, a sound pierced the stillness, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. Sarah's blood ran cold, her heart thumping in her chest. She stopped, the light from her flashlight trembling in her hand. Another growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on the forest floor. She wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned towards the noise. Her flashlight flickered, revealing nothing but the endless stretch of trees. But the growls continued, growing louder and more frantic. She could feel the presence of something large, something powerful, moving just out of sight. Suddenly, the beam of light caught a figure, half hidden behind a massive oak tree. Its shape was hunched, the silhouette of a creature, with twisted horns of a goat and the broad frame of a man. The eyes that gleamed from the shadows were unnatural, glowing with an eerie yellow light. The creature did not move, but it stared, unmoving, its gaze fixed on Sarah. A shiver ran down her spine as she took a hesitant step back. The growling stopped. The creature was gone. The forest had returned to its suffocating silence, but Sarah could still feel its presence lingering, watching her from the shadows. With a racing heart and trembling hands, she turned and fled, the sound of her footsteps crashing through the underbrush. The image of the Goat Man burned into her mind. The Goat Man wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was waiting in the darkness. The thick woods of Freetown Fall River State Park stretched endlessly before Mark, the path barely visible beneath the tangled underbrush. He had heard the rumors, the chilling tales of the dark forces said to haunt the park, stories of restless spirits, brutal murderers, and the whisper of the cult that once called this place home. But Mark, a skeptic by nature, had never put stock in such things. He was here for the thrill, to walk some paths where others claimed to have felt an unnatural presence. Then, from far off, a faint sound, footsteps, but not his own. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stopped, trying to peer into the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no figure emerged from the shadows. Mark's heartbeat quickened. Just as quickly as it came, the sound stopped. A low, guttural noise echoed from deep within the trees, something unnatural and chilling that sent a wave of dread over him. He strained his ears, but the noise had vanished. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted. A chill ran through his spine as the temperature seemed to drop, a frigid breeze sweeping through the trees. Mark turned to leave, but the path he had just walked was now shrouded in thick fog. It twisted and turned in impossible directions, disorienting him. The light from his flashlight struggled against the fog, casting only shadows that seemed to move on their own. Panic began to rise in his chest as he realized he was lost. In the distance, he thought he saw movement, a figure, pale and hazy, just beyond the reach of his light. His heart raced. With his pulse pounding in his ears, Mark broke into a run, pushing through the fog, not daring to look back. He didn't stop until he reached the park's edge, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting as he crossed into the open. Mark left Freetown Fall River that night with a new respect for the dark stories. Some legends, he realized, weren't born from imagination. They were rooted in something much older. The streets of Detroit were quiet that night, save for the occasional hum of passing cars. Megan walked briskly, the chill of late autumn nipping at her cheeks. She had always dismissed the stories of the Nain Rogue, the sinister red dwarf said to haunt the city, bringing misfortune in its wake. Yet, as she passed through the desolate stretch of Brush Park, a particular unease began to settle over her. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement, small, darting, too quick to be human. Her breath hitched as her gaze locked onto a figure at the edge of the street lamp's glow. It was no more than 3 feet tall, cloaked in tattered rags with skin as pale as frost. Its crimson eyes burned like embers, and a wicked grin split its grotesque face. The creature tilted its head as if sizing her up, before letting out a low chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her. Megan stumbled backwards, her mind racing. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the pavement, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The Nain rogue stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid, almost serpentine. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the streets, scattering leaves and extinguishing the distant streetlights. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the Nain rogue turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. Megan stood frozen, trembling, unsure if what she had just seen was real or the product of an overactive imagination. The next morning, news broke of a massive fire at a nearby factory, causing widespread damage and power outages across the city. Megan couldn't help wonder if her encounter had been a warning or a curse. From that day on, she avoided the streets of Detroit at night, haunted by the memory of the red-eyed figure that still lingered in the corners of her mind. The snow fell relentlessly, muffling the forest under a thick, oppressive silence. Jack trudged through the drifts, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He had wandered too far from his cabin while tracking a deer, and now the sun was slipping below the horizon. The dense pines around him cast long shadows, twisting into eerie shapes in the fading light. As he adjusted his rifle on his shoulder, a sudden snap of branches stopped him in his tracks. He turned, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then he saw it, or thought he did. A shape, impossibly tall and gaunt, moved between the trees. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin as pale as the snow. Jack's chest tightened. He'd heard the stories from his grandfather, the Wendigo, a creature born of hunger and greed, cursed to stalk the woods in search of prey. He always dismissed them as legends meant to scare children, but now, alone in the forest, those tales felt too real. The shape emerged again, closer this time. It moved with a sickening grace, its hollow eyes burning with a yellowish light. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears as he took a shaky step back, his breath freezing in the air. The creature's skeletal form seemed to glide, its head tilting in a natural way, as if it were savoring the moment. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the woods, a sound so inhuman it sent a shockwave of terror through Jack's body. When the scream ceased, the silence was even more deafening. The Wendigo was gone, leaving only Jack's ragged breaths and the rising howl of the wind. He didn't wait to see it again. Turning, he ran blindly through the forest, ignoring the branches that tore at his face and coat. By the time he stumbled back to the cabin, frost was clinging to his beard. He swore he could still hear that chilling scream carried on the wind. For years after, Jack avoided the woods during winter, but even in the safety of his home, he couldn't shake that feeling that the Wendigo was watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. The cemetery gates creaked in the wind, the rusted iron protesting against years of neglect. Emily had always been drawn to local legends, and the tale of the Witch of Yazoo City had captured her imagination. They said she was buried here, beneath the thick chains that bound her grave, a punishment for her wickedness and a warning of the curse she left behind. At last, she found it. A headstone surrounded by twisted chains, their links rusted but unbroken. The words etched onto the stones were weathered but still legible. The Witch of Yazoo, who swore vengeance on Yazoo City. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she stepped closer. She crouched to examine the chains, running her finger through the rough metal. The legend claimed that if the chains were ever broken, the witch's curse would come true, and the city would burn again just as it had in 1904. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the cemetery, carrying with it a scent of damp earth and something that smelled like sulfur. The branches of the nearby oak trees rattled, their gnarled limbs reached skyward like skeletal fingers. Emily froze, her heart pounding. Behind her, she thought she had heard the faintest sound, a low guttural moan, almost too soft to be real. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the empty cemetery. The wind died as abruptly as it had risen, leaving a silence so complete it felt suffocating. Emily's gaze returned to the grave, and she gasped. One of the chains had shifted, its position slightly different than before. The earth beneath it looked freshly disturbed, as though something had moved from below. Panic surged through her. She stumbled backwards, her pulse racing. The heavy sense of being watched settled in over her. As she fled the graveyard, the whispers of the wind carried what sounded like laughter, low, mocking, and cruel. Though she swore she would never return, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the Witch of Yazoo was not content to rest, her promise of vengeance waiting for its moment. The ornate facade of the Launders Theater loomed against the evening sky, its grandeur dimmed by years of whispered legends. Sophia had always been fascinated by the tales of ghostly sightings and eerie happenings within its walls. Alone, after hours, she stood on the creaking wooden stage, the theater silent except for the occasional groan of its old bones. She panned her flashlight across the velvet seats of the empty auditorium. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of stories about the man who had fallen from the balcony and the mysterious shadow that moved behind the curtain. She told herself the stories were just myths, exaggerated tales to give the old theater character, but as she stood there, a chill crept up her spine. From the corner of her eye, something moved. She snapped her flashlight upward, its beam catching nothing but rows of faded seats. She turned back towards the stage, but the atmosphere had changed. The curtains, heavy with dust and time, swayed ever so slightly, though there was no draft. A faint thud echoed from the backstage area, like footsteps. Sophia stepped towards the sound, her flashlight quivering in her grip. As she reached the wings, the beams caught the faint outline of a figure, a man, tall and dressed in what looked like old-fashioned attire. He stood motionless, his face obscured by shadow. Her breath caught as the figure turned and walked by silently towards the back wall. She blinked, and he was gone. Her instincts screamed to leave, and she obeyed, stumbling off the stage and into the lobby. Behind her, as she pushed through the old heavy doors, she thought she heard it, a single low note, as if someone had struck a key on the grand piano in the orchestra pit. Sophia never returned to Landers Theater after that night, but sometimes she wondered if the stories were more than legends, if the spirits of the past still lingered, reliving their final acts under the theater's dim lights. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs of the Yellowstone River Valley, carrying with it an ancient, mournful cry. Claire stood at the edge of Sacrifice Cliff. The town of Billings shimmered faintly in the distance. She had heard the legend, how two Crow warriors, stricken with grief after a plague decimated their tribe, rode their horses off the cliff in an act of ultimate sacrifice. Locals said their spirits still lingered, trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow. As Claire stepped closer to the edge, she noticed a sudden stillness. The wind that had been whipping her hair moments before had vanished. She turned to look behind her. The trail she had followed up the bluff was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. Then she saw them. At first, they were just faint outlines, barely visible against the twilight. Two figures on horseback, motionless, silhouetted against the fading sun. Claire blinked. She was convinced it was her imagination, but the figures remained. They stood side by side, their heads bowed as if in mourning. The horses snorted softly. The sound was so clear it was as if they were standing right beside her. The figures began to move, their horses stepping closer to the cliff's edge. Claire's breath caught as she watched, frozen. The riders moved with purpose, their forms becoming more solid with each step. When they reached the precipice, they stopped. The lead rider turned his head, and though his face was shrouded in shadow, Claire felt his gaze pierce through her. A sudden gust of icy wind swept over the cliff, forcing her to shield her face. When she looked back, the figures were gone. The only sound was the distant rush of the river below, but the weight of the moment lingered. Claire stumbled away from the edge, her legs trembling. She glanced back one last time and thought she saw faint impressions in the dust where hooves might have been. When she finally reached the base of the bluff, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in deep blue shadows. Claire looked up at the towering cliff, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the figures again. 2 riders etched against the stars, standing vigil in eternal silence. She whispered a silent prayer of respect before turning away, the weight of the legend now part of her own story. The wind howled through the Nebraska plains, carrying with it a biting chill that settled deep in the bones. As dusk fell, Emily and her friends drove their old pickup truck down a gravel road that seemed to lead to nowhere. Their destination was infamous among locals, Hatchet House, a decrepit, boarded-up structure that loomed like a dark shadow against the horizon. Legend had it that a brutal crime had taken place there decades ago. A reclusive farmer, driven mad by isolation, had turned on his family with a hatchet one stormy night. The story went that the house was cursed, and those that entered would hear the echoes of the farmer's rage, the thud of the weapon, the screams of his family, and the whispered regrets of his ghost. The truck stopped at the end of the road, headlights illuminating the house. Its windows were broken, and the roof sagged with the weight of decay. The group approached cautiously, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The wooden door creaked open with little resistance, revealing a darkness so thick it felt alive. Emily noticed the marks on the wall first, deep gouges as though something sharp had been swung with violent intent. She shivered, recalling the stories. In the corner of the room, a broken mirror reflected their light back at them in fractured pieces. Suddenly, the air changed. A low thudding sound began, faint but rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It seemed to come from upstairs. Her heart pounded as she froze, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The sound grew louder, closer. The floorboards above groaned as if something was moving. And then a loud crash sent the group running. Emily glanced back as they fled, catching a glimpse of something, an indistinct figure standing at the top of the staircase, outlined by the dim moonlight through a broken window. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. As they sped away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that legend wasn't just a story. The gouges, the sounds, and the shadowy figure weren't figments of imagination. Something, or someone, still lingered in Hatchet House. Matt drove his rusty sedan down the desolate road leading towards the perimeter of Area 51. He wasn't supposed to be there. Warning signs had made that clear, but curiosity had a pull stronger than reason. As he approached the barbed-wired fence that marked the edge of the restricted zone, his headlights revealed a barren landscape. No guards, no cameras, just a lonely desert under the weight of secrets. Matt parked his car, stepped out, and scanned the horizon. The air was still, unnervingly so. He climbed the fence, careful not to snag his jeans on the wire. Once on the other side, he felt an almost tangible shift, as though he'd crossed into a place where the rules of reality were different. Half a mile in, he saw it, a faint pulsing light just beyond a ridge. Matt's pulse quickened as he crept closer. Peering over the crest, he saw a metallic structure, sleek and otherworldly, bathed in an eerie glow. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a stark contrast to the mundane secrecy of military compounds. Then the light intensified. A high-pitched hum filled the air, growing louder and sharper. Matt instinctively ducked, shielding his eyes. The desert lit up as though it were daytime, and when he dared to look again, he saw something rise from the structure. It hovered smooth and silent, defying gravity. The craft tilted slightly, and for a moment, Matt swore it was watching him. Without warning, the object shot into the sky, disappearing in an instant. The desert was plunged back into darkness, the silence now deafening. Matt stumbled backwards, heart pounding, before sprinting to his car. Before he could get there, a black SUV rolled up, its doors opening in unison. Men in unmarked uniforms stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows. Matt raised his hand instinctively, but the men didn't speak. One of them reached into his pocket, pulled out a small black device, and held it towards Matt. Matt woke up hours later. He was back on the main road. His car was parked neatly, the engine running. But the memory of what he saw and the unsettling emptiness in his mind where details should have been left him with chilling certainty that he had seen something he was never meant to know. The small town of Henniker, New Hampshire lay quiet under the pale light of the moon. Jennifer had heard the tales of ocean-born Mary all her life, the legendary woman born on a pirate ship and later rumored to haunt the old colonial house where she had once lived. But tonight, standing before the house's weathered facade, Jennifer felt a strange pull, a need to know if the stories were true. Jennifer pushed open the creaking iron gate, stepping into the overgrown path that led to the front door. The door was slightly ajar, and as Jennifer pushed it open, the musty smell of aged wood and forgotten memories filled her senses. Her flashlight revealed a grand staircase at the center of the house, its banisters polished, smooth from centuries of use. She had heard that Mary's ghost often appeared on the staircase, descending slowly, her green silk gown shimmering in the moonlight. Jennifer wandered deeper into the house, her steps cautious on the creaking floorboards. The parlor held a large fireplace, its hearth blackened with soot. Above it hung a portrait, a woman with piercing green eyes and a regal posture. Was this Mary? As she studied the painting, a faint sound echoed through the house, a rustling like fabric brushing against wood. Jennifer froze. She turned her flashlight towards the staircase, and there it was, the faint outline of a woman descending the stairs. Her figure was faint, translucent, and yet undeniably real. Her ghostly figure moved with an unnatural grace, her gown trailing behind her as if caught in an invisible breeze. Jennifer's heart pounded, but she couldn't look away. The woman paused at the foot of the staircase, her face tilted as though listening for something. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, the figure vanished, leaving the room eerily quiet. Jennifer stood rooted in the spot, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and slamming the front door shut behind her. Jennifer fled, her footsteps echoing in the empty night. Later, she recounted her experience. She couldn't shake the feeling that ocean-born Mary wasn't an angry spirit, but a watchful presence, bound to the house she had once called home. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey were unnervingly quiet that night, save for the rustle of branches swaying in the wind. Kevin trudged through the dense woods, his flashlight casting long flickering shadows across the uneven ground. He had heard the stories of the Jersey Devil, a monstrous creature with bat-like wings, glowing red eyes, and hooves, but he didn't believe them, at least not until his curiosity drove him to these woods alone. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, sharp and deliberate. He swung the flashlight towards the sound, but the light revealed only tangled trees and thick underbrush. As he moved forward, the forest seemed to shift around him, the path disappearing into darkness. Then came the sound, a shrill, blood-curdling screech that echoed through the trees. Kevin froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The stories spoke of that scream, the terrifying call of the Jersey Devil. He swept his flashlight wildly, the beam catching something just beyond the tree line. Two glowing red eyes stared back at him, unblinking. Kevin's throat tightened as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The creature stepped forward, its form emerging from the shadows. A twisted, otherworldly figure with leathery wings outstretched and gnarled, claws gripping the forest floor. Kevin stumbled backwards, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The creature tilted its head, its eyes locked on him. Then, with a powerful beat of its wings, it took to the air, the force of the wind knocking Kevin to the ground. He looked up in time to see its silhouette against the moonlight, its scream piercing the night once more before it vanished into darkness. Kevin scrambled to his feet and ran, branches clawing at his clothes as he made his way back to the trailhead. The forest felt alive around him, every sound amplified by his fear. When he finally reached his car, he fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. As he drove away, the woods receded into the distance, but the image of those red eyes and the haunting scream stayed with him. For the rest of his life, Kevin never ventured into the Pine Barrens again. Certainly that the legend of the Jersey Devil was far more than just a story. The moon hung low over the arid New Mexico landscape, casting long shadows across the winding dirt road. Javier had heard whispers of La Llorona, the weeping woman, for years, but the old stories were just that, stories, or so he thought. After an argument with his family, he decided to drive out to the river alone, needing the solitude. The night was eerily still as he parked his truck near the water's edge. He stepped out, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. The Rio Grande stretched before him, a dark, silent ribbon under the starlight sky. Javier stood by the water for a while, his thoughts drifting aimlessly. Then he heard it, a soft, mournful cry, drifting over the water like a whisper carried by the wind. At first, he thought it was a trick of the night, a noise carried from some distant part of the riverbank. But the cry came again, this time louder, unmistakable. A woman's wail. Javier took a step closer to the water, his pulse pounding in his ears. The cry grew louder, closer, as if the woman was standing just on the other side of the river, hidden by the darkness. Then, through the trees on the far bank, he saw her. A figure in white, moving slowly along the edge of the water. Her long, wet hair clung to her face, and her arms were outstretched as if searching. The woman's cries grew desperate, her voice carrying the unbearable weight of grief and loss. Javier froze, his blood ran cold as he realized that she was moving towards him, her figure becoming clearer with each step. He could see the hollow look in her eye, the mournful expression that seemed to radiate centuries of sorrow. The cry came again, and this time it was a scream that cut through the night air, raw with pain. Without thinking, Javier turned and ran, his feet pounding against the earth, the sound of the weeping woman following him, growing louder with each passing second. By the time he had reached his truck, the sound had stopped. The night was still again, as if nothing happened. He didn't dare look back. As he sped away, Javier's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. He knew, without a doubt, that La Llorona was no mere legend. She was real, and she would forever haunt the quiet corners of the riverbank, waiting for the next soul to cross her path. The sun had barely set over Staten Island, casting an eerie glow across the thick woods that bordered the old abandoned mental asylum. For years, the name Cropsey had haunted the whispers of local children, an urban legend about a monstrous figure who stalked the forest, dragging kids into the shadows. It was just a story, a scary tale meant to keep children in line. At least that's what Jackson thought, as he and his friends dared each other to venture closer to the infamous building. Jackson could feel the temperature drop as they crossed the threshold into the courtyard, the darkness creeping in with the sun setting. The building was a maze of decaying hallways and broken windows, filled with the ghost of its past, forgotten screams, the heavy air of suffering. They explored the halls cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. Faded photographs lined the walls, twisted metal and shattered glass littered the floors. But as they ventured deeper into the asylum's belly, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. Jackson's heart began to race. The others were ahead, laughing nervously, their voices hollow in the vast emptiness. But something felt off. There was a shift in the air, a presence, just beyond their sight, something lurking in the dark corners of the building. A distant scraping sound had reached their ears, unnerving and relentless, like claws dragging across concrete. He turned a corner, and for a split second his flashlight caught something, a shadow, tall and hunched, moving between the broken walls. His pulse quickened, his instinct screaming to run. But he didn't. He moved closer, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then out of the corner of his eye he saw it, a figure tall and grotesque, with matted hair and hollow eyes. Jackson watched the figure, its movements deliberate and unnervingly calm as it disappeared into the darkness. A cold sweat ran down his back, and without thinking, he turned and bolted down the hall, shouting for his friends. They rushed towards him, eyes wide with fear, but Jackson didn't stop. The scraping sound had followed them, growing louder as they neared the exit. He could feel the presence closing in just behind them, as if Cropsey himself was haunting them through the twisted corridors. The group burst into the night, breathless, not stopping until they were far from the asylum, standing under the open sky. As they looked back at the silhouette of the building against the night, Jackson realized one terrifying truth. Cropsey was no mere story. He was real, and he still haunted the abandoned halls, waiting for his next careless soul to venture too close. In the heart of North Carolina, the dense forests surrounding Bladenboro were thick with mystery. It was the fall of 1953, and a quiet chill hung in the air. People spoke in hushed tones about something lurking in the shadows, something that hadn't been seen but was very much felt. The Beast of Bladenboro, they called it, a creature as elusive as it was terrifying. The town had been rocked by reports of dead animals that had been drained of their blood, their bodies mutilated in strange ways. Pets and livestock had vanished overnight, leaving only the eerie silence of a forest that seemed to hold its breath. Locals whispered that it was no ordinary predator. It was something more. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, a man named John decided to venture into the woods. He had heard the stories, but he believed them to just be that, stories. His lantern flickered as he walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of rustling leaves and distant howls echoing through the trees. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in on him, its shadows stretching unnaturally long. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. The air grew thick, suffocating. The faintest rustle caught his ear, and he turned, heart pounding. There, in the distance, something large moved between the trees, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the shape of a beast, towering and powerful, with muscles rippling beneath its fur. John froze. His instincts screamed to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The creature paused, staring directly at him, its presence heavy and menacing. Then, as if deciding he wasn't worth the chase, it disappeared into the night, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Shaken, John turned and rushed back to the safety of his home. The stories, now more than ever, seemed real. Bladenboro's legend was alive, and the Beast of Bladenboro was not just a myth. It was a creature that haunted the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike again. In the heart of North Dakota, where the flat plains stretch endlessly beneath a vast sky, there was a place known only to a few, Minniwashita. It wasn't marked on any maps, and the stories surrounding it were less tangible, slipping through the cracks of history like dust in the wind. The legend spoke of strange lights, eerie sounds, and an ancient force that lurked in the shadows, a presence that had been whispered about by the local indigenous tribes for generations. One evening, as dusk fell over the prairie, a young man named Luke, driven by curiosity and a need for adventure, set out to find this place for himself. His friends had warned him against it, speaking in nervous tones about the unsettling experiences they had heard from others who had ventured too close. But Luke, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a sense of bravado, ignored their concerns. The further Luke walked, the thicker the atmosphere became, and a strange heaviness settled over him. It was as though the world had become quieter, every sound muffled, and the air itself felt charged with an unsettling energy. When he finally arrived at the spot where Minniwashita was said to lie, the sky above had darkened completely, and the stars seemed to flicker unnaturally. In the distance, Luke thought he saw what appeared to be a faint, glowing light, dancing just beyond the horizon. He stepped forward, captivated by the strange sight, but the closer he got, the more the light seemed to move away from him, retreating as if teasing him. His heart began to race. He was no longer alone. A soft hum filled the air as the land itself was whispering, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Panic surged through him, and finally his legs moved, carrying him back through the fields, desperate to escape whatever force had drawn him there. By the time Luke reached the safety of his car, the lights were gone, leaving only the echo of the strange hum lingering in his mind. He never spoke of that night again, but the experience stayed with him, gnawing at him as he tried to rationalize what had happened. In the end, he knew one thing for sure. Minniwashita was no myth. It was a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blurred, and sometimes legends were meant to be left undisturbed. On the outskirts of a small, forgotten town in Ohio, there stood a crumbly ruin known only as Gore Orphanage. Time had worn away much of its structure, leaving behind jagged walls and broken windows, but its dark history lingered like an unshakable shadow. The stories about this place were disturbing. Whispers of mysterious fires, the unexplained deaths of children, and a haunting that refused to let go. One evening in the 1950s, a group of young thrill-seekers, eager to test their courage, made their way to the site. Among them was Justin, a skeptic who had always dismissed the tales as nothing more than local superstition. His friends spoke of the orphanage with a mix of fear and fascination, but Justin only chuckled, certain there was no ghostly force at work. The once grand structure loomed before them like a forgotten nightmare, its silhouette barely visible through the haze. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Justin remained unfazed, joking as he led the group through the creaking gates. They ventured inside, their footsteps echoing through the halls. The walls, stained with age and decay, seemed to whisper faintly as though carrying the memories of the orphanage's tragic past. A strange unease began to settle in, but Justin brushed it off, urging his friends deeper into the building. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the silence. Everyone froze, their hearts pounding in their chest. A heavy door slammed shut somewhere in the distance. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. The temperature dropped even further, and a faint cold breath seemed to brush past them, though no one was near enough to cause it. Then, in the dim light, they saw it. A shadow, indistinct but tall, moved swiftly across the room, vanishing through the broken frame of a doorway. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal, it was something else entirely. Something that had once called the orphanage home, perhaps. Justin, for the first time, felt the weight of the stories. The fear that had once seemed so foreign now gripped him. With shaking hands, he turned to leave, but the others were already running. They didn't need to say a word. The sense of dread was enough to send them all fleeing in terror. As they reached the safety of the road, Justin glanced back one last time. In the distance, the fog seemed to pulse, as though the orphanage was alive, waiting, watching. The ruins of Gore Orphanage were no longer just a place of local legend. They were a warning, a testament to the restless spirits that refused to be forgotten. Justin never returned to the site, but the memory of that night haunted him long after he left. In the quiet, secluded hills of Oklahoma, nestled deep within the woods, there existed a place few dared to visit, Shaman's Portal. The land, thick with ancient trees and eerie stillness, was said to be a threshold to another world, a site where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. For generations, the indigenous people spoke of the portal in hushed reverence, warning that only those with pure intentions could approach without consequence. To others, it was nothing more than an urban legend, a story spun from the strange, inexplicable occurrences that had plagued the area for decades. One afternoon, a man named Ethan, an outsider who had heard the tales, decided to see for himself. Armed with little more than curiosity and a sense of adventure, he ventured into the woods, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. After what felt like hours of walking through the forest, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing. At the center of it stood a large, flat stone, worn and jagged with age. The ground around it was unnaturally still, as though the earth itself had been frozen in time. In the air, there was a subtle hum, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the atmosphere. Cautiously, Ethan stepped forward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The moment he touched the stone, the world seemed to shift. A chill ran through him and his vision blurred. For a brief moment, the forest around him seemed to warp, and he saw figures, shadowy, indistinct, moving just beyond his sight. They were not human, but something else, something ancient. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if the portal were calling to him. The eerie silence returned, but it was different now, thicker, heavier, as though the very air had changed. The forest no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt alive, watching, waiting. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, the hum still echoing in his mind. As he made his way back through the woods, the feeling of being pursued never left him. When he finally reached the edge of the forest, the world seemed to return to normal, but the weight of what he had felt lingered in his bones. From that day on, he never spoke of what had happened at Shaman's Portal. The place had revealed something he wasn't meant to understand, something far beyond the realm of the living. He had crossed a threshold and learned that some legends were not meant to be uncovered. In the dense fog-covered woods of Oregon, there was a stretch of road known as the Bandage Man's Highway. The locals spoke of an old twisted legend, one that had been passed down through generations, of a man horribly disfigured and wrapped in bandages, who had haunted the area, seeking revenge for an accident that had left him scarred. The story was a chilling one, and the most who heard it dismissed it as nothing more than folklore. But those who lived nearby, the fear was real. One late autumn night, a young couple, Jane and Mark, found themselves driving down the winding road, their headlights cutting through the thick fog. They had heard the stories, but they were skeptical, convinced that the tales of the Bandage Man were just that, tales. They laughed as the road twisted and turned, but as the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to settle over them. As they neared the bend in the road, Mark slammed on the brakes. The headlights illuminated something in the distance, someone standing in the middle of the road. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and wrapped in what appeared to be tattered bandages. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as the car came to a halt just feet away. It was as if he materialized out of the fog. Jane's heart raced as she gripped the seat, urging Mark to go. Mark, too stunned to react, stared at the figure, his mind racing with disbelief. The bandaged man remained motionless, the faintest glow from the headlights revealing the distorted, grotesque form beneath the wrapping. His face, hidden beneath layers of cloth, seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. In an instant, the figure lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if something otherworldly controlled it. The car's engine roared to life and Mark sped away, his foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. Jane turned in her seat, her breath quickening, but when she looked back, the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog. The rest of the drive was silent, the fear still hanging thick in the air. They didn't speak of it again, but both knew they had seen something that night, something that wasn't of this world. The bandaged man's legend, once a story to be laughed at, had come to life and had left a mark on their memories. From that night on, neither Jane nor Mark ever drove down that stretch of road again. The fog, thick and oppressive, was no longer just a weather phenomenon. It was the cloak that concealed something far darker, something waiting in the shadows. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, there was a stretch of road that locals whispered about with a mix of fear and curiosity. The legend of the bus to nowhere had circulated for years, of a bus that appeared out of nowhere, ferrying passengers to an unknown destination, only for them never to return. No one knew exactly when or where it appeared, but those who claimed to have seen it spoke of its eerie, desolate presence often late at night when the roads were empty and the fog rolled in thick. One evening in the fall, a young man named Ryan, eager to prove his bravery, decided to investigate the legend for himself. He had heard the stories countless times, and like many before him, thought they were simply urban myths. He drove his car out towards the secluded road that the bus was rumored to take. The streets were quiet, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The road twisted and turned, and as Ryan rounded a sharp bend, he saw it, an old weathered bus sitting at the side of the road, its lights dim but glowing faintly through the mist. The bus was unlike any he had seen before. It was worn, its paint peeling, and the windows were fogged over, making it impossible to see inside. The strange thing is it hadn't been there moments before. There was no way it had appeared out of thin air, yet here it was, as if it had always been waiting. Ryan slowed the car to a crawl, his curiosity piqued. The bus seemed abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it, something that tugged at him, urging him to approach. He parked the car at a distance, the fog thickening around him, and he stepped out. The air was unnaturally cold, and a strange stillness hung in the air. As he walked towards the bus, the doors creaked open, as if inviting him in. Before he could reach the door, however, the fog thickened even more, and the bus suddenly revved its engine. Without warning, it pulled away, vanishing into the mist as quickly as it appeared. Ryan stood there, frozen, heart racing, as the sound of the engine faded into the distance. The fog remained, suffocating and thick, but the bus was gone. He never saw it again. The legend of the bus to nowhere was no longer a tale to be laughed at. It was reality that lingered in his mind, a reminder that some roads lead to places better left unexplored. In the quiet coastal town of Rhode Island, there was a legend that had circulated for decades, a tale passed down in whispers among the locals. Fingernail Freddy. The story was a chilling one. Freddy was a hermit who had lived in the outskirts of town long ago. He was said to be a recluse, hiding away in his dilapidated house, only emerging under the cover of night. What made the legend so unsettling were the reports of his unnaturally long fingernails, so long and sharp they could slice through anything with ease. Over time, the townspeople claimed that Freddy had disappeared, though some believe he had become something more, something not entirely human. His presence, they said, still lingered in the woods. One evening in the fall, a young man named Lucas, eager to prove his bravery and skeptical of the local myths, decided to venture out and find Freddy's old house. He had heard the stories all his life, but he didn't believe in ghost tales or anything that went bump in the night. Armed with a flashlight and an unshakable sense of confidence, He made his way through the dense woods where Freddy's house was rumored to stand. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, perhaps an old shack, abandoned and forgotten, or maybe nothing at all. But as he pushed forward, a strange sensation crept over him. Then, through the trees, he saw it, a dilapidated house barely standing, its windows dark and lifeless. The wooden structure seemed to sag under the weight of time, and the faintest chill ran down his spine as he approached. The house appeared abandoned, but as he stepped closer, he thought he saw something, movement, a shadow flickering just inside the broken window. A cold shiver swept through him, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The door creaked open with a slow groan, revealing an interior shrouded in darkness. Lucas stepped inside, his heart pounding. Suddenly, there was a sound, soft like nails dragging across wood, the unmistakable scrape of something long and sharp against the floor. Panic surged through Lucas, and he turned to flee, but as he reached the door, a sharp cold breeze swept past him, and he felt someone, standing behind him. Without looking back, Lucas bolted out of the house and into the woods. His feet pounded against the ground as he ran, not stopping until he reached the safety of his car. The next day, Lucas tried to brush off what had happened as just an overactive imagination, but something about that night stayed with him. He never returned to the woods, and the legend of Fingernail Freddy, once just a story, was no longer a myth. It had become something far more real, something that lurked in the shadows of Rhode Island's forgotten corners. In the deep swamps of South Carolina, hidden beneath the thick canopies of cypress trees, there was a place that locals spoke of in hushed tones, Scape or Swamp. For years, the swamp had been the source of strange tales and chilling sightings, but none more infamous than the legend of the Lizard Man. Described as a creature with the body of a man but covered in scaly green skin, it was said to emerge from the murky waters, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, terrorizing anyone unlucky enough to cross its path. One hot summer evening, a young man named Cody, fueled by a mix of bravado and curiosity, decided to venture into the swamp to uncover the truth behind the legend. He had heard stories from his grandfather and had long dismissed them as mere exaggerations. He set off alone, determined to find the source of the strange noises and fleeting shadows that had haunted the swamp for decades. As he walked into the swamp, the moonlight barely filtered through the thick foliage above. The further he went, the more the sense of isolation grew. Suddenly, a low rustling sound broke the silence. Cody froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the trees. He turned slowly, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The rustling grew louder, and he could hear something. Large, heavy steps crunching through the underbrush, moving closer. Then, from the edge of the water, he saw it, glowing eyes peering out from the shadows, watching him intently. The creature was tall and humanoid, but its skin was covered in rough, scaly patches that shimmered in the faint light. Its body was twisted and unnatural, standing on two legs like a man, but its movements were too fluid, too predatory. The lizard man stood motionless for a moment, its eyes locked onto Cody, before it slowly stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the swamp. The feeling of being watched lingered long after the creature had gone. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, Cody turned and fled, his heart racing as the sound of the swamp seemed to come alive around him. When he made it back to his car, drenched in sweat and trembling, the swamp was as quiet as it had been when he'd first arrived. But Cody knew better now. The legend of the Lizard Man was no longer just a story. It was a warning, and the creature that lived in Scape or Swamp wasn't just a figment of imagination. It was real, and it had seen him. In the wide open plains of South Dakota, where the wind howled through the vast stretches of grass and the sky seemed to swallow everything in its path, there was a legend that few dared to speak of. The story of Walking Sam. Known to many as the spirit of despair, Walking Sam was said to appear as a tall, shadowy figure with long, outstretched limbs, wandering the remote areas of the Pine Ridge Reservation. It was said that those who encountered him were overcome with a deep, overwhelming sense of sadness, leading them into the darkest corners of their minds. One fall evening, a young woman named Amanda decided to visit that very place where the legend was said to linger. The stories of Walking Sam had haunted the community for years, but Amanda was tired of hearing the warnings. She drove out alone, away from the small town and deep into the wilderness, her headlights cutting through the darkness as the roads grew narrower and the trees thicker. After what seemed like hours, she arrived at a clearing, and the headlights of her car illuminating the space. There, standing on the far edge of the woods, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly still. It was the unmistakable shape of a man, but there was something wrong about it. The figure's arms hung way too low, and its body seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if it were more a shadow than flesh. The figure did not move, and yet Amanda felt its presence, an overwhelming weight on her chest, as though the air itself had turned to lead. A wave of sadness, so deep and profound, surged over her, almost suffocating in its intensity. Without warning, the figure seemed to fade into the night, dissolving into the shadows from which it emerged. The wind picked up again, a sharp gust rushing through the clearing, carrying it with an eerie calm. Her hands shaking, she turned the car around and sped back down the road, not daring to look back. The figure, walking Sam, was no longer visible, but Amanda knew she had seen him, had felt the deep despair that accompanied his presence. The memory of that night lingered in the back of her mind, a reminder that some legends were more than just stories. They were real and terrifying, waiting in the shadows of the South Dakota wilderness. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, nestled in the heart of the woods, there stood a farm once owned by the Bell family. The farm had long since fallen into decay, but the legend of the Bell Witch lived on, a haunting tale that had been whispered through the generations. The spirit, said to be the vengeful ghost of a woman named Kate Batts, had tormented the Bell family in the early 1800s, bringing with it strange sounds, unsettling whispers, and inexplicable movements. Even though the farm was abandoned, the story of the Bell Witch continued to stir fear in the hearts of those who lived nearby. One misty autumn afternoon, a man named Nate, skeptical of the local folklore, decided to visit the old Bell farm. As he approached the remains of the Bell house, the air grew colder, the fog thickened around him. The house stood in ruins, its walls crumbling and the roof barely intact. He stepped cautiously inside, his flashlight flickering as it illuminated the rotting wooden beams and shattered glass. The floor creaked under his weight, and a low groan echoed through the empty space. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. It was soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but then it grew louder, more distinct, as though something was murmuring right beside him. Nate froze, his heart racing. The whisper became clear, unintelligible words that seemed to dance around his ears. He swung the flashlight frantically, but the beam cut only through empty air. Then, the house groaned again, louder this time, as if the very walls were protesting his presence. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, and a cold draft swept through the room. Without thinking, Nate turned and bolted for the door, his breath ragged and his legs trembling beneath him. The whispers faded, but the unease remained, clinging to him like a heavy rock. The Bell Witch, once just a story to him, had become a chilling reality, one that left a mark on his soul, a reminder that some legends were far too real to ignore. In the heart of Texas, near the banks of the Medina River, a quiet legend had long haunted the small rural communities, one of the Donkey Lady. The story had been passed down for generations, a tale of a woman who, after a tragic accident, was transformed into a grotesque creature with the body of a human, but the head of a donkey. The Donkey Lady was said to roam the woods, her eerie braying echoed through the woods at night, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to trespass on her land. One evening, a group of friends, curious and daring, decided to visit the stretch of the road near the Medina River where the Donkey Lady was said to appear. They had heard the whispers from the locals, but like many before them, dismissed the stories as nothing more than old folklore. The air was thick with the sound of insects and the distant rush of the river as they walked along the old, desolate road. The group laughed and joked, their voices breaking the silence, but there was an unease in the air, an unsettling stillness that clung to the woods around them. Suddenly, a low, guttural bray echoed through the trees, cutting through the quiet like a knife. It was a sound that sent a jolt of fear through the group. They stopped in their tracks, the blood draining from their faces. The braying grew louder, closer, almost as if it were right behind them. Panic surged through their bodies, and they turned to flee, their footsteps hurried and frantic as the sound of hooves seemed to pound the earth in pursuit. As they ran, a figure emerged from the trees ahead, a hulking, twisted silhouette with the unmistakable head of a donkey and a body that was all too human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its hands, if they could be called hands, reached towards them with terrifying unnatural speed. The group bolted, the sound of their own frantic breath drowning out the eerie braying behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the car, heartbeat still racing, the image of the donkey lady burned into their minds. As they sped away from the woods, the figure vanished into the trees, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread in the air. The donkey lady was no longer just a legend to them. It was a reality, a twisted figure that haunted the woods near Medina River, waiting for the next unwitting soul to cross her path. In the vast, rugged expanse of Utah, where the red earth stretched out endlessly beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow everything, there existed stories that no one dared question. Among these tales, the legend of the Skinwalkers was feared the most. These shape-shifting creatures, said to be witches capable of taking on the form of animals, had haunted the Navajo lands for centuries. The Skinwalkers were believed to be able to mimic human voices, lure unsuspecting travelers into the wilderness, and strike fear into the hearts of those who dared to venture too far into the desert night. One evening, a young man named Jason, seeking adventure and intrigued by the old stories, set off alone into the remote canyons of Utah. He had no intentions of seeking out the Skinwalkers. He only wanted to experience the vast isolation of the place, to escape the noise of the world for a while. Jason's flashlight flickered as he navigated the narrow, winding paths of the canyon, his footsteps the only sound in the otherwise still air. Suddenly, a rustling sound from behind a distant rock caught his attention. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. The noise came again, low, rhythmic, like something large moving through the brush. His flashlight swept across the canyon, revealing the dark silhouette of the rocks. A sharp crack of a twig broke the stillness, closer this time. Jason's pulse quickened, and he turned in the direction of the sound. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the shadows, large and animal-like. But when he shined the light, there was nothing there, just the empty, rugged land. He hurried back to his car, his mind racing. But as he turned to head back, the air shifted. A voice, soft, barely a whisper, called his name from behind him. Jason froze, his blood running cold. The voice was his own, unmistakable yet distorted, as if it came from a far distance. His heart pounded in his chest, but he dared not turn around. Instead, he broke into a run, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, the sound of his breath loud in his ears. When he finally reached his car, breathless and trembling, the desert around him had returned to its eerie stillness. The land was empty, except for the occasional gust of wind, but Jason knew, as he looked back in the dark expanse of the canyon, that something had followed him. Something that no longer was just a legend. The Skinwalker, it seemed, had found him. From that moment on, the desert was no longer a place of adventure. It was a reminder that some stories, no matter how terrifying, were born from the truth. And in Utah's deep canyons, the Skinwalkers are always watching. In the sleepy town of Stowe, Vermont, nestled among the whispering trees and winding roads, there stood a weathered bridge known as Emily's Bridge. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, telling the story of a young woman named Emily who had tragically died on that very bridge, heartbroken after her lover failed to meet her there as promised. The legend claimed that Emily's spirit still haunted the bridge, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to cross it after dark. Those who had ventured on the bridge at night claimed to have seen her ghostly figure, heard the sound of footsteps behind them, or felt the cold, clammy touch of a spirit that refused to rest. One evening, Nathan was eager to test the boundaries of his own bravery and decided to visit Emily's Bridge. He drove out to the bridge, the car's headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in from the nearby mountains. The bridge, old and worn, stretched across the darkened river below, its wooden planks creaking in the breeze. As he approached the middle of the bridge, the silence deepened. He paused, shining his flashlight over the water, the beam trembling in his hand. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Movement. A shadow darted across the far side of the bridge, too quick to make out. Nathan's heart rate quickened. He turned towards the shadow, but there was nothing there. The bridge was empty, the air cold and still. He felt a pressure in the air, as if something was closing in on him, and the hairs on his neck stood on end. A distant sound, like the faint echo of footsteps, reached his ears, sending a chill down his spine. Suddenly, the temperature dropped and the sensation of cold fingers brushing against his back made his blood run cold. He spun around, but there was nothing there behind him, just the empty bridge and the dark forest beyond. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the wooden planks, but the beams could not dispel the feeling of someone, lingering close by. His mind raced, and without a second thought, he turned and fled, his footsteps heavy against the wooden planks as he sprinted back towards his car. He didn't look back as he sped away, the haunting sensation of eyes upon him following him until the bridge was far behind. Emily's bridge, once a curiosity to him, was now a place of fear, an unsettling reminder that some legends weren't just stories. On the outskirts of Fairfax County, Virginia, where the dense woods seemed to close in on the narrow roads, there is an old railway bridge that carried a sinister legend. The locals called it the Bunny Man Bridge. Stories of a man dressed in a rabbit costume who would haunt the area, wielding an axe and chasing anyone who dared to come too close. Some said he was an escaped convict, others claimed he was a ghost of a disturbed soul. Either way, the bridge was a place of fear and curiosity. One chilly October night, Nicole, a college student home for break, decided to visit the bridge with a small flashlight and her camera. The dirt road leading to the bridge was lined with trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick and still, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath her. When she reached the bridge, the moonlight illuminated its crumbling stone and the graffiti-covered walls. The air seemed colder there, the silence oppressive. Nicole stood under the bridge, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She aimed her camera at the structure, snapping photos of the eerie surroundings. But as the flash went off, she caught a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, her flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the faint rustling of leaves in the windless night. The uneasy feeling in her chest grew as she moved closer to the center of the bridge. Her flashlight beam caught something on the ground, a pile of broken branches arranged in an unnatural pattern. The air seemed heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on her. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound, distant but growing closer, like metal dragging across stone. Her pulse quickened, and she swung the flashlight towards the source of the sound. A shape emerged from the shadows, a figure standing just beyond the bridge, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was tall, its outline distorted by the dim glow, but she could make out something horrifying. Long, floppy ears perched atop its head, and what looked like an axe glinting in its hand. Panic set in, and Nicole turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the dirt path as she fled back towards her car. When she finally reached her car, she jumped in and locked the doors, her hands trembling as the engine started. She sped away, the bridge disappearing in a rearview mirror, but the memory of that figure stayed with her. Nicole never returned to the Bunny Man Bridge, and she didn't need proof anymore. The legend was real, and she had seen it with her own eyes. In the dense forest of Washington, far from the bustling cities and the quiet towns, there was a place whispered about by locals, Mel's Hole, a deep, mysterious pit said to stretch endlessly into the earth. It was rumored to have strange, supernatural qualities. Some claimed it was a bottomless hole. Others said it could heal the dead or turn animals into strange, unrecognizable creatures. Despite the stories, no one has ever truly investigated, and the pit's existence was left to the realm of legend. A man named Derek, intrigued by the rumors and driven by his own curiosity, decided to find Mel's Hole. He had heard the stories from an old friend who swore they had seen the hole, but like many before him, Derek was skeptical. As he walked, the stories echoed in his mind, the tales of strange occurrences near the hole, the chilling reports of people who had gone in and never come out. But he dismissed them as superstitions, mere folklore meant to keep people away. After hours of trekking, Derek arrived at a clearing, and there it was, a deep, unnerving hole in the ground. Its edges were jagged, the earth around it disturbed, as if someone had been pulled down into it. The pit seemed to swallow the light, its depths shrouded in a darkness that no flashlight could penetrate. Derek stood at the edge, peering down into the unknown, the air growing heavier as he leaned closer. A faint, unnatural hum seemed to emanate from the hole, though he couldn't pinpoint its source. Without hesitation, Derek tossed a small rock into the pit, waiting for the sound of it hitting the bottom. But there was no sound. Nothing. The rock seemed to fall forever, swallowed by the darkness without a trace. His heart raced, the hum growing louder, vibrating through the soles of his boots. Something about the hole felt wrong, as if it were drawing him in, beckoning him to step closer. He turned to leave, but then he saw it, a dark shape moving at the edge of his vision. It was quick, almost too fast to make out, but there was something wrong about it. Derek turned and ran, his heart pounding through his chest, the hum of the hole still vibrating through the air behind him. He didn't stop until he was back at his car, gasping for breath, his mind racing. The forest was silent again, but Derek knew what he had felt. Mel's hole was real, and the stories had not been mere legends. There was something in that hole, something ancient, powerful, that should never be disturbed. In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist curled through the trees and the rivers cut deep through the valleys, the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, had long been steeped in mystery. For years, the locals had whispered of an eerie creature, the Mothman, with glowing red eyes and massive wings that spread like darkness itself. People spoke of strange occurrences in the 1960s, sightings of the creature, car accidents, and a looming sense of foreboding that seemed to accompany its presence. But most dismissed the stories as mere superstition, until the unthinkable happened. One foggy evening, a young woman named Sarah, who had grown up in Point Pleasant, returned to the town after many years. The small town had changed little since her childhood, the streets still quiet and the houses nestled closely together. As Sarah drove into town, following the narrow winding roads that led towards the river, the fog had thickened as dusk fell, and the world outside her car windows seemed to disappear into a white haze. She passed the old TNT area, where strange events had once been reported, unexplained sightings, strange lights in the sky, and figures in the distance. It was a place of mystery, a place Sarah had always avoided in her youth. A shadow moved across the road in front of her, just at the edge of her headlights. For a moment, Sarah thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a deer moving through the fog, but then she saw it again, a large, dark shape, far too large to be an animal. The shape was no longer moving with the grace of an animal, but in strange jerky motions as if were gliding across the ground. She turned the headlights on full beam, her heart thudding in her chest. What she saw made her blood run cold. A massive winged figure, its body shrouded in darkness. Its glowing red eyes reflected the light of her car, like twin lanterns in the dense fog. The creature stood tall, its wings unfolded like the pages of a dark book, casting an ominous shadow over the ground. Sarah froze, her hands gripping the wheel as the Mothman stood before her, its form shifting in and out of focus within the thick fog. The creature didn't approach, but Sarah felt its presence pressed against her like a physical weight. Then, without a sound, it unfurled its wings and took into the sky, disappearing into the fog with a sweep of darkness. The mist swallowed it whole, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. Sarah sat frozen, her breath shallow, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. The creature was gone, but the memory of its presence lingered, haunting her. The drive back to town was a blur, her eyes never leaving the rearview mirror, half expecting the Mothman to appear once more. Point Pleasant, for all its quiet charm, had a dark secret, a secret that some things in the mist were never meant to be understood. The Mothman was real, and it was waiting. Deep in the heart of the Wisconsin woods, where the trees grew thick and the underbrush seemed to hide secrets in the shadows, there was a legend that had been passed down for generations. The Hodag. This creature, a fearsome mix of bear, wolf, and reptile, with spiked horns and a body covered in thick, scaly skin, was said to prowl the dense forest around Rhinelander. Though many dismissed the tale as folklore, there were whispers of strange occurrences, disappearances, footprints larger than any known animal, and unsettling growls echoing through the woods at night. Evan, an outdoor enthusiast, decided to hike through the woods to see if there's any truth to the legend. The forest was dense and quiet as Evan ventured deeper into the woods. The sun had long begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees, and the temperature began to drop. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl broke the silence, echoing through the forest like a distant thunderclap. Evan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was unlike any animal he'd ever heard, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth. He held his breath, his flashlight trembling in his hand, but the sound didn't come again. For a moment, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Then, through the trees, something moved. It was quick, too quick, and before he could react, a massive shape darted across his path. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as the growl echoed again, much closer this time. He could feel the vibrations on the ground beneath his feet, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned quickly, retracing his steps towards the trailhead, his breath shallow and ragged. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig felt like a threat. The growl came once more, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, a creature moving through the forest with a terrifying grace. When he finally reached the edge of the woods and the safety of the clearing, he didn't stop running until he was in his car, the engine roaring to life beneath his hands. The next day, Evan couldn't bring himself to share what had happened. He had no proof, no footage, just a lingering memory of the growls and the rush of terror that had driven him to flee. The hodag, for all its mythical nature, was real in that moment, something ancient, something that lurked in the Wisconsin woods, waiting. In the vast open plains of Wyoming, where the wind howled across the lands and the Platte River wound its way through the landscape, there was an old legend, the tale of the ghostly ship that had been drifting along the river at night. The ship was said to appear out of nowhere, its sails full despite the absence of wind, and its lights flickering like the eerie glow of lanterns. No one knew the origins of the ship, but it was said to carry the souls of those lost long ago, doomed to sail forever along the river, never reaching their destination. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the river, a young man named Andrew found himself in the area. Andrew set out on a small boat, drifting along the water, his flashlight the only source of light in the growing darkness. But as the night deepened, a strange stillness settled over the water. The wind died down, and the world seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Andrew continued his journey, unaware that something was stirring in the distance. Suddenly, a soft glow appeared at the far end of the river. Faint at first, but growing brighter with each passing moment. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the light slowly became more distinct, forming into a shape of a ship, an enormous silent vessel, its sails billowing despite the lack of wind. The ship glided effortlessly across the water, its presence both majestic and haunting, casting an ethereal reflection on the calm surface of the river. Andrew's heart began to race as the ship drew closer. Its eerie glow illuminated the water, but as he tried to move closer to get a better look, the ship seemed to recede further into the distance. He paddled faster, his eyes locked onto the glowing silhouette, but no matter how hard he tried, the ship always stayed just out of reach. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the ship was not bound by the laws of nature. It moved with an unnatural grace, its sails untouched by the breeze and its path unbroken by the river's current. Finally, with his hands trembling and his breath coming in shallow gasps, Andrew turned his boat and began paddling back towards the shore. The ship, as if sensing his retreat, seemed to fade into darkness, its light dimming until it was nothing more than a memory on the river. When Andrew finally reached the shore, his heart still racing, the world around him returned to its peaceful stillness. The river was calm, the stars bright above, and there was no sign of the ghostly ship. He didn't speak of that encounter to anyone, but from that moment on, he knew that Platte River held more than just water and land. It held the lingering echoes of the past, the shadows of the lost, and the ghostly ship that sailed forever in search of its final destination.